They had been warned all their lives. If Canadians captured them, there would be no mercy, no protection, no way back home. As the German front collapsed in northwest Europe in 1944 and 1945, women wearing military uniforms prepared themselves for surrender. Many were not combat soldiers. They operated radios, telephone exchanges, and communications posts. But they believed surrender meant humiliation, violence, perhaps death. What happened next was not what they had been taught to expect. Before we go further, tell us in the comments which city and country you're watching from, because this story begins with fear and ends with something no propaganda ever predicted. The warnings did not come from a single source. They came from classrooms and radio broadcasts, from official briefings and whispered conversations in barracks and shelters. They came from posters pasted on walls and from officers who spoke quietly, as if passing on dangerous knowledge. Surrender, they were told, did not mean safety. It meant humiliation, it meant violence. For women, it meant something worse still, something that did not need to be named out loud to be understood. By late 1944 and early 1945, as the German front collapsed across northwest Europe, thousands of women wearing military uniforms carried those warnings with them. Many were not combat soldiers. They were radio operators, telephone clerks, administrative assistants, auxiliaries assigned to communications and logistics. Some had volunteered out of belief. Others had been assigned when the war demanded more bodies than ideology could supply. All of them wore the uniform. And all of them understood what that uniform was supposed to mean when the enemy finally arrived. They had prepared themselves for cruelty. What they had not prepared for was what came next. For years, German propaganda had been consistent on one point. The enemy was brutal, especially the enemy from across the Atlantic. Canadians were portrayed as barely civilized, violent men who resented Germany and would take revenge wherever they found weakness. The images were crude but effective. You did not need to believe them fully for them to shape your expectations. Fear does not require conviction. It only requires repetition. For women in uniform, the fear carried an additional weight. They had heard what happened when armies collapsed. They knew the stories from the East, where the Red Army advanced with its own reputation. They knew that choosing who captured you could be the difference between survival and something worse. And yet, even choosing carefully did not feel like choosing safety. It felt like choosing the least terrible outcome from a list of terrible possibilities. As Allied forces advanced through Belgium and the Netherlands, surrender became inevitable. German positions disintegrated, not with dramatic last stands, but with exhaustion. Supply lines failed, orders stopped arriving, units dissolved into fragments. In that chaos, women who had once operated radios in orderly offices found themselves hiding in basements, abandoned buildings, makeshift shelters that still smelled of chalk dust or oil or damp concrete. They waited. They waited for shouting. They waited for gunfire. They waited for the moment the propaganda would prove itself true. When Canadian soldiers finally appeared, it was not as they had imagined. There were no speeches, no dramatic confrontation, no declaration of victory meant for their ears. There were orders spoken plainly, hands raised, weapons placed on the ground. A pause while someone checked papers and counted heads, and then something strange happened. Nothing. No one struck them. No one screamed. No one made a show of power. The silence was worse than violence would have been. Violence, at least, would have confirmed what they thought they knew. The Canadians moved with a kind of practiced efficiency that felt unsettling. A sergeant asked if anyone was injured. The question itself was disorienting. Injury was something you worried about for your own side, not for prisoners. When the women shook their heads, he nodded once and gave instructions about what would happen next. The words were formal, almost bureaucratic. Transport, search, holding facility. At the time, none of them realized how deeply this moment would stay with them. They were searched upstairs, in rooms that had once served civilian purposes, offices, classrooms, spaces that still carried traces of ordinary life. In one case, the search was conducted by a female military police officer. That alone disrupted years of expectation. The search was thorough, impersonal, professional. No contempt, no cruelty, no kindness either, just procedure. Outside, soldiers waited beside trucks. Some smoked, some talked quietly. A few glanced at the prisoners with mild curiosity, the way one looks at unexpected paperwork at the end of a long day. There was no hatred visible on their faces. If it existed, it was contained. That containment was the first crack in the story they had been told. The truck doors closed, engines started, and the women were driven away from the places where they had expected to die, toward a future that felt impossibly undefined. What unsettled them most had not even happened yet. The holding facility was a converted school building some distance behind the front line, 15 kilometers, give or take. The war moved quickly enough that numbers like that lost precision almost as soon as they were spoken. The building still smelled faintly of chalk and cleaning solution. Desks had been removed, bunks installed in neat rows, everything arranged according to categories that mattered more than individual stories. Men in one area, women in another, officers separate from enlisted personnel. It was all very orderly. A liaison officer explained the process in careful German. 3 to 5 days, interviews, verification of identity, classification according to the Geneva Convention. The words sounded unreal. Conventions were abstract things, discussed in training manuals and ignored in emergencies. Yet here they were, invoked calmly, as if the world had not just spent years tearing itself apart. Understanding and believing were not the same thing. The women watched the system function around them with growing confusion. Food arrived at regular intervals. Not generous portions, but consistent ones. Soup, bread, sometimes something warm to drink, water that was clean. The predictability itself felt dangerous, as if it might disappear at any moment. They waited for the cruelty to begin. It did not. This story reflects patterns described across multiple post-war testimonies rather than a single documented case. Accounts vary in detail, but the structure of the experience remains strikingly consistent. Personal hygiene supplies arrived one morning: soap, tooth powder, combs. Items so ordinary they would have seemed insulting in another context. Here, they carried weight. Months of scarcity had taught them that nothing could be taken for granted. The supplies were distributed without comment, with the same mechanical efficiency that governed everything else. This was neither cruelty nor obvious kindness. It was something harder to categorize. If the Canadians had been demonstratively kind, making speeches or offering reassurance, it would have been easier to dismiss the behavior as propaganda of another kind. But there were no speeches, no effort to win hearts. The system functioned because it had rules, and the rules were followed. One afternoon, weak sunlight filtering through windows that had once faced a playground, an older woman spoke what many had been thinking. They were being treated the way prisoners were supposed to be treated, the way official reports claimed prisoners were treated, the way Germany said it treated prisoners. The observation landed heavily. The women laughed without humor. Some made bitter remarks about the gap between reports and reality. But the question lingered, uncomfortably persistent. If this was how the enemy behaved, what did that say about everything else? The questions felt dangerous even to think. They were more dangerous than capture itself, because capture was external, something done to you, something you could endure while holding on to your internal sense of right and wrong. These questions came from inside. They undermined assumptions that had structured entire lives. A week into captivity, a medical examination took place. It was more thorough than anything some of the women had experienced in years of German service. The doctor was methodical, focused on tuberculosis and other communicable diseases. His concern was practical, not ideological. Disease in crowded facilities was a problem. Problems required solutions, another small fracture in the framework of belief. By the third week, when transport arrived to move prisoners deeper into liberated territory, the women had stopped waiting for the cruelty to begin. Not because they trusted their captors. Trust implied a relationship that did not exist, but they understood now that whatever was happening was not personal. They were not being punished. They were not being rewarded. They were being processed, and that realization was both dehumanizing and strangely reassuring. Rules, unlike emotions, were predictable. The convoy moved slowly through the Netherlands in early April. Roads were damaged, bridges unreliable, stops frequent. During those stops, the women saw the world beyond their immediate captivity. Dutch civilians emerged cautiously from damaged buildings. Their expressions ranged from relief to exhaustion to something harder to name. Children appeared, curious but restrained by parents who remembered what occupation looked like and were not yet ready to believe liberation would be better. At one stop, in a town whose name the women never learned, a Dutch woman approached the truck. Her clothes were mended repeatedly, her shoes held together with careful repairs. She carried a basket covered with a cloth. A Canadian guard intercepted her. There was a brief exchange in Dutch. The woman gestured toward the truck, then lifted the cloth. Inside were apples, small, withered from winter storage, real fruit in a time when real fruit was more valuable than currency. The guard hesitated, visibly uncertain. The woman nodded firmly and spoke again. He accepted the basket. The apples were distributed among the prisoners, 3 apples for every 4 women to be shared. One woman stared at her portion, unable to understand what she was holding. This was a Dutch civilian. The Netherlands had been occupied for 5 years. Dutch families had starved during the hunger winter, while German forces maintained their own supply lines. She had every reason to hate everyone wearing a German uniform. And yet, she had brought apples. The truck moved on before anyone could speak. The apple was eaten slowly, stretched into as many bites as possible, not out of hunger alone, but out of confusion. One of the older women finally broke the silence. The apples were not brought because the prisoners deserved kindness, she said. They were brought because the woman had chosen not to let hatred consume her capacity to see hungry people. The observation lingered, heavy and unresolved. That moment was only the beginning. Over the following days, similar gestures accumulated. Water offered during stops, access to wells, brief, careful kindnesses extended without fanfare, each one a small but persistent contradiction. The propaganda had promised hatred from liberated civilians. Instead, the women saw relief directed at Canadian soldiers. Children ran toward military vehicles, not away from them. They expected chocolate, not violence. The world was not arranged the way they had been taught. Only later would they understand how deeply this realization would follow them. The questions that followed were more dangerous than capture itself. At first, the women tried to dismiss them. Fatigue could explain confusion. Hunger could distort perception. Temporary restraint might precede harsher treatment later. It was safer to assume that what they were experiencing was an exception, a brief pause before reality reasserted itself. But the days passed and the pattern did not change. Food continued to arrive on schedule. Not abundant, not generous, but sufficient. Medical attention was provided when necessary. The sick were separated from the healthy, not as punishment, but to prevent outbreaks. Paperwork accumulated. Interviews were conducted. Names recorded, roles classified. Everything moved forward according to procedures that seemed to operate independently of emotion. This was not kindness in the way they understood the word. Kindness implied intention, feeling, a personal choice. What they were experiencing felt colder than that, more impersonal, and somehow more unsettling. One of the women later described it as being caught inside a machine that did not care who you were, but cared deeply that it functioned correctly. That distinction mattered. If cruelty had come, it would have confirmed the narrative they had lived with for years. Cruelty would have allowed them to maintain a clear moral boundary. Us and them, victims and monsters. Reality was refusing to cooperate. The women watched Canadian soldiers move through their routines with an ease that felt almost inappropriate given the scale of destruction surrounding them. These were men who had been fighting for months, sometimes years. Men who had seen friends killed, who had slept in mud and cold, who had endured shell fire and exhaustion. Nothing in the women's experience of war had prepared them for soldiers who looked ordinary. They talked about home. They complained about rations. They joked quietly among themselves. They followed orders. They filled out forms. The hatred, if it existed, did not shape outcomes. That realization began to erode something fundamental. One afternoon, as supplies were distributed, an older clerk who had spent most of the war in administrative offices spoke again. The words came slowly, as if she were testing them before allowing them into the open air. "They are treating us the way we were told we treated prisoners," she said, "the way the rules said it was supposed to work." No one contradicted her. They all understood what she was really saying, that the rules Germany claimed to uphold had become theoretical long before the war ended. That cruelty had not always been accidental, that systems reflected values, whether they admitted it or not. This was the point at which many accounts describe a shift, not relief, not gratitude, but something quieter and more corrosive: doubt. Doubt did not arrive all at once, it arrived in fragments. It arrived in the form of clean bandages replaced regularly, even when supplies were strained. In the form of mail procedures that allowed prisoners to write home, even though there was no guarantee the letters would reach anyone. In the form of guards who corrected each other when rules were not followed properly. One woman later wrote that she had expected individual cruelty. What she had not expected was institutional restraint. If individuals had been kind, she could have dismissed it as personal weakness. But this was something else. This was a system that required its members to behave within limits, even when no one was watching. That idea was deeply unsettling, because it raised a question that could not be answered without confronting uncomfortable truths. If the Canadians could maintain these standards while fighting an active war, processing thousands of prisoners, operating far from home with stretched supply lines and constant pressure, then why had Germany not done the same? The question did not accuse individuals. It accused structures, and structures were harder to defend. The women were not naive. They knew that cruelty existed in every army. They had heard stories. They had lived in a war long enough to understand that no side held a monopoly on violence. But what they were encountering challenged the assumption that brutality was inevitable. That it was simply what happened when men with weapons met enemies in moments of collapse. It was not inevitable. That realization carried a weight they were not prepared to carry. A week later, a medical examination took place, more thorough than many of them had received during years of service. Records were kept carefully, recommendations made, follow-ups scheduled. The doctor was indifferent to their nationality. His concern was disease control, tuberculosis, malnutrition, infections that spread quickly in crowded spaces. He worked through his checklist methodically, as if the war existed somewhere else, another small fracture. At the time, no one thought of these moments as important. They seemed trivial compared to the scale of destruction around them. Only later would survivors identify them as turning points, because these moments forced a confrontation with a dangerous possibility that the enemy was not what they had been taught, and if that was true, then what else had been wrong? This was not a realization that brought comfort, it brought instability. For some women it triggered anger, not at the Canadians, but at the system that had sent them into war unprepared and misinformed. For others, it produced shame. Gratitude felt like betrayal. How could one feel relief at professional treatment from an enemy without questioning one's own role in sustaining the war that made such captivity necessary? Most chose silence. They learned quickly that silence was safer than articulation. Speaking these thoughts out loud risked isolation. Even among fellow prisoners, not everyone was ready to confront the implications. Some clung more tightly to the old narratives, insisting that the real cruelty would come later, that this was only a facade. But as weeks passed, that explanation became harder to sustain. Transport arrived again in early April. The convoy moved deeper into liberated territory. The women were loaded into trucks and driven through landscapes that told their own story. Dutch towns bore the scars of occupation and fighting, buildings damaged by shellfire, streets emptied of civilians who had learned caution the hard way. And yet something else was visible too: relief. It was unmistakable. Civilians emerged slowly, watching the convoys pass. Their attention was directed not at the prisoners, but at the soldiers escorting them. The expressions on their faces were not hostile. They were tired, curious, sometimes openly grateful. Children appeared more quickly than adults. They ran toward vehicles with an ease that spoke volumes. Children did not run toward occupiers. They ran toward people they believed would not hurt them. The women noticed this immediately. This was not what they had been told would happen. The propaganda had insisted that liberated populations would resent the Allies, that occupation by foreign armies would bring new suffering. Instead, the women saw gestures that contradicted everything they had learned. At one stop, a Belgian farmer brought water. At another, a family allowed prisoners brief access to a well and an outhouse. These were not dramatic acts. They were practical, cautious, but unmistakably human. The propaganda had prepared them for hatred. It had not prepared them for restraint. The apple episode was discussed quietly for days afterward, not because of the food itself, but because of what it represented, that a civilian who had every reason to despise German uniforms had chosen not to. This was not forgiveness. It was something simpler and more destabilizing. Recognition. Recognition that prisoners were hungry, that hunger did not disappear because of nationality, that suffering did not require moral agreement to be acknowledged. The women struggled to place this recognition within the framework they had lived with for years. Some attempted to rationalize it. Perhaps the woman did not understand who they were. Perhaps she believed they were civilians. But the uniforms were visible. The guards were clear. The gesture had been deliberate. Others suggested it was rare, an anomaly. One kind individual among many hostile ones. But similar moments followed, and with each repetition, the anomaly explanation weakened. The convoy continued. The women were aware that not all treatment was gentle. They saw collaborators handled roughly by their own communities. They saw anger, grief, and revenge play out in ways the Canadian military police observed with visible discomfort, but limited authority. Liberation was not clean. It was complicated and often ugly. But the Canadians maintained their distance from civilian reprisals. They did not encourage them. They did not participate. They enforced their own rules within the boundaries they controlled. That distinction mattered. Again and again, the women encountered the same pattern: discipline, distance, procedure. It was not affection, it was consistency. This consistency forced a confrontation with another uncomfortable truth. Propaganda works best when it simplifies. It divides the world into absolutes, good and evil, civilized and barbaric, victim and aggressor. Those categories had sustained the women through years of war. Now those categories were dissolving, not because the Canadians were heroes, but because they behaved like professionals. That difference was devastating. If the enemy could be professional, then perhaps morality was not inherent to nationality. Perhaps it was embedded in systems, incentives, and choices made long before individuals ever met on a battlefield. These were not thoughts the women wanted to have. They were dangerous thoughts. They destabilized loyalty, they undermined sacrifice, they raised questions that could not be answered without acknowledging complicity, even if indirect. For many, the safest response was to stop thinking about it altogether. They focused on routines, on counting days, on maintaining emotional distance, on survival. But the questions did not disappear. They simply waited. Waiting became the dominant experience of captivity. Waiting for interviews, waiting for transport, waiting for news that never arrived, waiting for the war to end. And in that waiting, the contrast between expectation and reality continued to widen. The women noticed how Canadian soldiers reacted to them not as symbols but as logistical problems. Problems to be managed efficiently. This was not flattering. It did not feel humane in the sentimental sense. But it meant that individual emotions mattered less than institutional behavior. Hatred could exist privately. It could not dictate outcomes. That separation between feeling and action was new to many of the women. In their own system, emotions had often been amplified and weaponized. Hatred had been cultivated deliberately. It had shaped policy, not merely rhetoric. Here, emotions were constrained. This realization did not bring comfort. It brought clarity, and clarity, in the context of defeat, is a heavy burden. By the time the convoy reached its next holding area, many of the women had stopped expecting violence altogether. Not because they trusted the Canadians, but because the evidence no longer supported fear as a rational response. Fear had been replaced by something else: uncertainty. Uncertainty about what would happen next, about what awaited them after the war, about how they would explain these experiences to others, or whether they would explain them at all. Uncertainty about what it meant to have survived a war built on lies. Years later, survivors would describe this period as the most difficult part of their experience. Not the hunger, not the surrender, but the slow realization that the world was more complex than they had been allowed to believe. That realization did not feel like liberation. It felt like standing on unstable ground with no clear direction forward. And the most unsettling part was that it had been created not by cruelty, but by its absence. The war did not end all at once. For the women in captivity, it ended slowly in fragments, through notices posted on walls, rumors carried by guards, changes in routine that hinted at something larger, shifting beyond the perimeter. The sound of artillery moved farther away. Air raids became less frequent. The guards grew tired in a different way, the kind that follows completion rather than urgency. When the official announcements came, they were almost anticlimactic. Germany had surrendered. The fighting was over. The women expected some dramatic change, celebration, anger, retribution, a reckoning of some kind. Instead, the routines continued. Meals arrived, roll calls were conducted, paperwork advanced, the system absorbed the news and kept functioning. That, too, was unsettling. Freedom, when it finally arrived, did not arrive as freedom at all. It arrived as waiting. Waiting to be processed, waiting for transport, waiting for instructions that would determine where they would go next and when. Some women would be moved again, deeper into Allied-controlled territory. Others would remain where they were for weeks or months. A few would be transferred to different camps under different authorities. The end of the war did not simplify logistics. It complicated them. Waiting became the defining feature of the aftermath. In that waiting, the women noticed changes in themselves that were difficult to articulate. Fear receded, but it did not vanish. It transformed into something quieter, less sharp, more persistent. They were no longer afraid of immediate harm. They were afraid of memory. They began to understand that what they had experienced would not fit easily into the stories that awaited them at home. The narratives of defeat and betrayal were already forming. In those narratives, the enemy was still brutal, still inhuman. Admitting otherwise risked being seen as disloyal, naive, or worse. Gratitude was not an acceptable emotion. Relief was complicated. Silence was safer. Some women kept private records, letters hidden and never sent, notes scribbled on scraps of paper and tucked into coat linings, observations recorded not for publication, but for the simple act of preservation, to reassure themselves later that what they remembered had actually happened. Others committed themselves to forgetting. Forgetting felt like survival. The Canadians did not ask for testimony. They did not seek validation. They did not attempt to shape the story that would be told afterward. They processed prisoners, enforced rules, and prepared for redeployment. Their role in the women's lives was temporary by design. That impermanence mattered. It prevented the experience from becoming sentimental. It left no neat resolution. There was no final conversation that tied everything together, no symbolic gesture meant to close the chapter, just departure. One morning, transport arrived, names were called. Papers checked, personal belongings returned. In some cases, small sums of money were issued to facilitate travel, enough for a train ticket, enough for food along the way. The women gathered what they had, which for many was very little. As they boarded trucks and trains, they looked out at landscapes that bore little resemblance to the world they were returning to. Cities lay in ruins, infrastructure barely functioned, the familiar markers of home had been erased or transformed. The journey back was long and disorienting. Some traveled through regions devastated by bombing. Others passed through towns that had been spared but emptied by displacement and loss. Train stations were damaged or improvised. Delays were constant. Information was unreliable. During those journeys, the women spoke little about their captivity. They talked about practical matters, routes, rations, where they might find family, if family still existed. They avoided the topic not because it was painful, but because it was difficult to place. What words could describe professional restraint from an enemy without inviting suspicion? What language could capture a system that maintained standards without offering comfort? The memories resisted simplification. When the women finally reached their destinations, the reception varied. Some found relatives waiting, others returned to empty homes. Some discovered that entire neighborhoods had vanished. The war had rearranged the map in ways that no announcement could undo. Reintegration was uneven. In the immediate aftermath, survival took precedence over reflection. Food, shelter, work. These were the urgent concerns. The experiences of captivity were set aside, not resolved but postponed. Time passed. Years passed. Germany rebuilt itself with remarkable speed. Cities rose from rubble. New institutions formed. New narratives took hold. The emphasis was on moving forward, on rebuilding, on drawing a line between past and future. There was little space for complicated stories. For many women, the safest option remained silence. They raised families. They worked. They participated in the collective effort to reconstruct a country that preferred not to dwell on moral ambiguity. In public, they repeated the accepted explanations. In private, they carried something more complex. Occasionally, the memories surfaced. A smell, soap, chalk dust, clean bandages. A routine interaction that triggered the recollection of a system that functioned when everything else had failed. Some women eventually spoke, decades later, when distance softened the risk. When historians began asking questions that allowed nuance. When grandchildren, studying a past that felt impossibly remote, sought to understand experiences that had shaped lives without being recorded. The accounts that emerged shared a common structure. Fear before capture. Shock at professional treatment. The slow collapse of propaganda when confronted with reality. The difficulty of reconciling that reality with the stories that had justified the war. Not every account was positive. Not every interaction had been neutral or fair. But the pattern persisted strongly enough to demand attention. The women struggled most with how to interpret what they had experienced. Some framed it as an exception, a brief moment of order amid chaos. Others saw it as evidence of something broader, that systems mattered, that discipline constrained behavior, that humanity did not require affection, only restraint. Few drew grand conclusions. Most settled for something smaller and more durable. They remembered. Memory did not resolve the contradictions, it preserved them. One woman, in a letter discovered long after her death, wrote that the Canadians had not saved her life in any dramatic sense. They had simply chosen not to take it. They had chosen to maintain standards that suggested her life had value, even though she was their enemy. She wrote that she did not understand this at the time. She was not certain she understood it even years later. But she remembered it. That remembering became the legacy. The Canadian soldiers involved likely forgot the details quickly. A blanket replaced, a form completed, an order followed. For them, it was routine. Another day in a war filled with days that demanded attention and then receded. But for the women, these moments acquired weight over time. Memory is selective in strange ways. It preserves what once seemed insignificant and allows dramatic events to fade. The moments that survived were not the ones expected to last. Not the surrender, not the transport, but the absence of cruelty where cruelty had been promised. The world moved on. Canada demobilized. Soldiers returned home. Civilians resumed lives interrupted by years of war. The Canadian military's actions during the campaign in Northwest Europe became part of official histories, studied for their effectiveness and discipline. The women's stories remained largely private. And yet, those stories matter. Not because they redeem anyone, not because they offer comfort, but because they complicate a narrative that is too often simplified. They show that war is not only a contest of weapons and ideologies, but of systems and choices. That how an army treats its enemies says something about what it values, even when no one is watching. The Canadians did not seek to be remembered for this. They did not construct monuments to procedural restraint. There are no statues commemorating forms filled out correctly or standards maintained under pressure, but the impact endured quietly, in the space between fear and reality. In the long silence after the war ended, in the uncomfortable knowledge that the world refused to align with the lies that had sustained it. For the women who lived through it, that knowledge did not bring peace. It brought responsibility. Responsibility to question, responsibility to remember, responsibility to accept that humanity can exist without sentiment and that discipline can sometimes achieve what kindness alone cannot. The war ended in 1945. Its consequences did not. They lived on in memory, carried forward not as a story to be celebrated, but as a truth to be endured. And in that endurance, something fragile but essential remained intact: the refusal of the world to be as simple as propaganda demanded.